Well, there is news that I'd like to discuss today, um, but I think that the most important thing is that I address the death of Rush Limbaugh, because everyone really who does anything similar to what I do or listens to anything similar to what I do, who listens to podcasters, who listens to really anything that is not on NBC, ABC, CBS, or CNN, um, they really should thank Rush Limbaugh. Rush founded the alternative media. He is the foundation of all alternative media. Rush taught all of us, at least, I shouldn't say all of us, but really indirectly, even if you didn't learn it from him, you learned it from somebody else who was influenced by him, that it's okay to disagree with the media and with what they say. Now, does that mean that Rush was always right? No. I think that for a long time, Rush was wrong on a lot of stuff, and I think that he, like myself, grew throughout his life. I think that over the last 10 years in which, my views have changed, his views have changed too. Maybe gone in different directions, but I mean, people evolve over time. And so when a political figure dies, it's not really fair to judge them based off of views that they've held at one time or another, because those sorts of things are ephemeral. The issues of the day come and go. And so what matters really is their overall impact and sort of the essence of their being. And so overall, what Rush represented to me was someone who thought for themselves. And again, that does not mean that I have to agree with him all the time. But every time I turned into Rush's show, or I tuned in, I knew that I was going to get his perspective and that he had his own perspective. No matter what the issue was, I could not tell you necessarily what exactly he would say. He's not, Sean Hannity reading off of a script. And that's where his talent really comes in, his talent as a broadcaster. And that to me is something different than that's sort of a subset. That's not necessarily the biggest part of his legacy. I mean, again, the biggest part of his legacy is breaking the corporate media's monopoly on information and on perspective. He was the first person who had a platform, or who built a platform, to challenge the framing of their news stories and to really question that they were totally objective and things like that. I mean, back in the 80s, it was, pretty well accepted that what the media put out was news. There was no real concept until the 90s, and thanks to Rush, that there was anything wrong with the media and that they were trying to manipulate us as people. And for me, as someone who grew up in the 2000s, it's hard to imagine people just trusting the media. But I think that's the way things were before Rush. And you hear that when older folks talk about how, journalists used to be so respectable, and they used to tell the truth and just report the facts. And whereas I look back in history and I see lots of examples of journalists just creating pure propaganda. And, that's when it occurs to me that really, before Rush, people did think that journalists were objective. And so when Rush came on the air in the late 80s, I guess during the first Bush administration, that's when, my family, which, was alive before I do, that's when they remember first hearing Rush. He was the first one to challenge the media narrative. But the thing is about Rush is that he didn't, it wasn't just like he came on and he presented his worldview and sort of stated it as fact. He was one guy, and he gave his alternative perspective. He wasn't doing the same thing like with the media guys would do, where they would come on, and all three networks plus CNN would present, sort of this uniform narrative. And because it was coming from four different outlets, you would think, well, that just must be the unvarnished truth. Rush came in and gave, his perspective, but he was one man. He wasn't, sort of a force of, the arbiter of truth. And he had callers who would call in, and they would present their perspective. And so, yes, for a long time, it would sort of seem like it's a binary choice, like, oh, well, Rush is giving the Republican perspective, and everyone else has the Democrat perspective. That's how you could break it down if you want, but that's not really the impact that he had. Because once Rush came along, that opened a space for other people, eventually people like, such as myself. And so, and again, I'm not trying to say that I'm anywhere that I have I'm an ant compared to Rush, but I and everyone else who presents their own unique perspective, counter to the corporate media, we have to pay our respects to him. He did not just pave the way for conservative media. Conservative media is one subset of alternative media. But there are plenty, and there's, of course, establishment conservative media, which isn't really, it's hard to lump that in with alternative media. But everyone else, from, Jimmy Dore to Tim Pool, all these people who are not conservatives, Joe Rogan, they followed in Rush's path. Rush made it okay for people to have their own perspective, no matter what it was. You did not have to, because it was, once you break that monopoly on information and on perspective that the corporate media had until the 1980s, once that's broken, you can't just impose your own new monopolistic narrative. And I don't think that Rush, attempted to do that. I think that really he just wanted to provide his perspective, and which he considered to be the perspective of a large swath of this country, and that's why he resonated so much with people, because I think especially at that time, it's hard for me to relate, because even though I felt this, I don't think it was nearly as strong as someone like my father or grandfather would have felt listening to Rush back in the early 90s, when there literally was no one else who felt like they understood people of the right, people on the right in this country, even if they didn't like me. If you don't have to agree with them 100%, but the fact that there's anyone out there who's at all sort of taking things somewhat from your perspective and presenting not necessarily your views, but challenging the views that you disagree with, that's a powerful thing. It feels empowering. It lifts people's spirits because it makes them feel like they're not alone. And sadly, really, my three big heroes in broadcasting are deceased now. You had Don Imus, Art Bell, and now Rush, and they've all died within a few years of each other. And it's, and both Art Bell and Rush now, and really Don Imus, because Don Imus, even though he looked like he was 102, he wasn't that old. He was in his 70s. They've all died pretty young. Art, I think, was in his early 70s too. Imus, early 70s. Rush, barely 70. And of course, Art Bell came on pretty soon after Rush, I believe. I don't think that, I'm pretty sure that Coast to Coast at least started only in the early 90s, mid 90s. Like the earliest show that I've heard from Coast to Coast was like from 1995, I think. But Art, too, presented his own perspective. But again, really, after Rush started, that was when it opened the floodgates for all these other guys to start coming in. And Rush was also the first guy who was, he was the first, modern cancel culture really started with Rush, because he was the first guy who the media tried to cancel. And they tried so many times that, people eventually lost count. But before the term cancel culture ever existed, they were trying to cancel Rush. But the reason why they couldn't get rid of him is because, he did not work for, the corporate overlords so much. He did not work for NBC, ABC, CBS, or CNN, and so they couldn't just fire him. If Larry King had come out and said the things that Rush said, they could have just fired Larry King. But, as people have pointed out, Rush saved AM radio. I heard today, actually, that in Europe, they don't have AM radios in their cars anymore. And, the obvious reason for that would be because in Europe, there's no Rush. These AM stations, they would be dead without him. So there was no way you were going to get rid of him. And his audience, no matter what he said, they were not the ones who were mad at him. And so the ratings were not going to decline because, CNN says, ooh, Rush said a naughty word. Time for him to get canceled. He could be kicked off of Monday Night Football. But they couldn't kick him off of his show. And so he gave a lot of people courage to speak up and speak their mind. Again, no, it's not just about if you share his perspective. If I agreed with every word that came out of his mouth, his show would be boring. because I would know exactly what he would say, because it's exactly what I'm thinking. He's not, as a host, does not try and do that. I think Hannity probably tries to do that. He follows the audience. But with Rush, it was different. The audience followed him. And things were always a conversation, which, that's the nature of talk radio as a medium. You have a much more, the hosts have to be much more down to earth because they interact directly with their audience. These TV anchors never have to do that. And so, really, talk radio was kind of I think other people have said this before, the first social media, because you have the host talking, sure, but then you have people calling in from all over. And, in the case of Art Bell's show, which, not to skew us off and make this into a tension about Art Bell, but his show back in the 90s, I believe, he would take input from people all over the world through the internet. He was one of the first shows to stream live over the internet, one of the first shows to have podcasting. And Art Bell was on these stations that carried Rush. And so this is directly, you don't have Coast to Coast without Rush Limbaugh, I don't think. Coast to Coast was the night show for these stations that carried Rush during the day. So what my point here is that the relationship between Rush and his listeners is similar to between someone on YouTube and the comments section, or in the case of a live stream, the chat there. And again, the very idea that all of us we can have our own ideas, we can say what we want, we don't have to fall into a neat little box like your corporate media types. This all started with Rush. And so even though I've never listened to him regularly, because, for most of my life he was on while I was in school and couldn't listen to him. And then, early in the years after, I hadn't been that interested. I would listen to him occasionally. But when I did listen, I could notice a change in him over the years. I do think that he was definitely a very intelligent person, and he was a decent person. And I always respected his opinions when I would listen to his show. It was not, I didn't just think of it as garbage, flowing into my ears. And a lot of times, these things, these shows, whether they're interesting or not, it's kind of topical. He's not the kind of person, I wouldn't say, who could make anything interesting, because, a lot of times when you discuss issues of the day, this is just sort of getting into the format. If you discuss every political issue every day, whatever's in the news, a lot of times the stuff that's in the news is boring. And I guess you could say that's one negative of Rush's influence, is that he set the standard that people who disagree with the media should essentially take the stories of the media and react to them, because that's kind of what he does. His show was a live reaction to whatever the corporate media was putting out on any given day. And if the corporate media was talking about stuff that is just boring to me, then Rush's show is not interesting. And so one step beyond what Rush did is people in the alternative media deciding to discuss things that are not emphasized by the mainstream media. And Rush did that to a certain extent. And, of course, because of his platform, if he wanted to make a big deal out of something, he could really elevate a story. And, he did curate his own news, but he was still reacting to stories that the mainstream was putting out. And it was I think it would be rare if the media was just exploding about some big issue, that it was a dumb story, blowing it up. It would be rare for Limbaugh to ignore it. Now, he might bring in other stories, too, that they didn't really want to emphasize, and he would, put some time into that. But with a 3-hour show, he's not going to ignore whatever nonsense the media happens to be going on about for that day. His style would more be about explaining why whatever they're talking about is dumb. And that's, that serves a purpose, because people who are listening to that stuff, it's important to have some pushback on that. But you need more than that. You need not only to demolish their narrative, but there's only so much work that one man could do. But again, he paved the way for everyone else to come in and emphasize different stories. Again, kind of like, which is what I try and do. I try every day not to focus on whatever the big story of the day is, which is why I'm sort of reluctant whether I would even talk about Rush, since that is the big story today and yesterday. But I think that it would be rude of me not to. So that's why I'm doing it, in his honor. But again, all of this would not be possible without him. And I don't think that anyone will ever fill his shoes, because he was a man of his era. He was someone who was in the right place at the right time, and his impact can't be reversed. There's not a role to fill. He accomplished so much, and that's not going to be undone. So you're not going to have someone who's going to fill his shoes and continue doing what he did, because he's done it. You can't go back in time and have somebody else accomplish all those things, because really all of us here talking to each other and circumventing, disintermediating the corporate media, we are his legacy. And so as long as we keep this up, Rush will live on. So with that said, if you get anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I do have new ones. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.